Installing new floors can completely transform how your house looks. Just look at the difference flooring made here. Hi, I'm Henry from the Serendipity Place, and today we'll cover how to install tongue and groove flooring in your next project. This will be an extensive guide, so feel free to use the timestamp below to skip to whatever is most important to you. Let's start off with the overview. We will be covering 5 main points with multiple topics within each point. Those 5 main points are types of plank flooring, prep work, tools needed or that are useful, how to install it, and finally, tips and tricks. With that all in mind, let's hop into the first point. As far as types of tongue and groove plank flooring, we'll specifically be using white oak engineered flooring by Mohawk. The other common plank that you'll see is called luxury vinyl plank, or LVP for short. These are 2 popular options you'll see when you're looking at tongue and groove plank flooring. Let's start off with the key points to consider when purchasing either one of these planks, that way you can build your knowledge on flooring. Starting off with the engineered planks, one of the primary reasons people choose it is because of the top layer on the planks are real wood veneer to emulate the look and feel of real hardwood. The top layer is about 2 to 3 millimeters thick. This means that you can feel the grooves and patterns on the plank, and when you walk on it, it feels rigid like real hardwood floors. Compared to LVP, which is a screen print pattern and feels a little more soft and flexible, which takes away from the hardwood floor illusion. Another thing to keep in mind is engineered wood is generally more expensive than LVP. There's a lot of variance in pricing, so some LVP can actually be more expensive than engineered wood, but on average, engineered wood will be more expensive per square foot. Finally, engineered wood is water resistant, not waterproof, so depending on where you'll be using it, it might be better to go with LVP planks instead. Moving on to LVP flooring, there are 3 main considerations when looking at this type of flooring. These 3 points would be the variety of finishes, the cost, and the waterproof design. Since the top layer is vinyl, the color and designs are almost limitless. That means that finding the specific shades of flooring with certain patterns is much more feasible with LVP compared to engineered floors. As mentioned before, LVP is cheaper than engineered wood and shares the majority of the benefits. Who doesn't love being able to spend less money while still gaining most of the benefits? And the last big reason is that waterproof feature. If your project area has a lot of water like a bathroom or a laundry room, the LVP is going to be a much better choice since these planks will not be damaged by the water. Since the LVP does not have the wood veneer on the top layer, it's able to be completely waterproof. Now that you know the main information that makes each one of these planks unique, let's talk about what makes them similar. This part will be a general overview since each manufacturer adds their own unique features to each one of their planks. 1. Both are built in layers to provide support and durability. Generally, the top is the wear and print layer. The wear layer helps resist scratches, stains, and what makes it easy to clean. The print layer is what gives each board their unique look and design. Just under that is the core layer, which determines the rigidity of the plank based upon the composites that they use as well as the thickness. The last layer you'll usually see is the underlayment layer. This helps with sound absorption and makes it a little bit softer when walking on it. 2. Both are easy to clean and maintain. 3. Insulation is identical if they're both tongue and groove. 4. They both have high durability ratings. 5. Both can be installed over existing suitable flooring. 6. Both come in a variety of widths and lengths. Now that you know all the important stuff about LVP and engineered planks, let's move on to the application of these planks, starting with the prep work. The first thing to look at is the current floor that you want to replace. Is it carpet that will need to be removed before you can install the new planks? Or is it existing flooring where you can build on top of it? You first have to make sure the floor is suitable for laying down underlayment. That means clearing out all debris from the floor, since this can create uneven spots and potentially buckle other sections of flooring. Next, you'll want to look throughout your project area for baseboards, door trims, doors, and anything else that may need to be removed or modified before you start flooring. Some common things that we run into are outlets in the ground, fireplace connectors, quarter rounds, and floor vents. Some of these may simply need to be removed, then replaced, while others may require modifications for them to fit back in their appropriate spot. After you've cleaned and prepped your project area, you'll want to make sure it's all level. It does not have to be perfectly level, but it does need to be within a certain tolerance to prevent dips, bumps, or buckling. A good way to check is to build a couple rows on top of an area that is uneven and walk on it and see if it gives you any issues. If it doesn't, you should be fine to move forward. But if it does, you may need to look into other options to make it level. This may include using self-leveler, using more underlayment, or any other material to make it level. If your problem area is too high, you may need to end up using a grinder, a planer, or something else to make it level with the rest of your floor. Next, you will want to decide what direction your planks will be running. If you're replacing the whole home, generally people choose to run their planks parallel to the longest length of the room. Your final step will be to lay down the underlayment. Laying down underlayment is easy. All you have to do is unroll it, cut it to size where applicable, and place this plastic end facing outwards towards the next row of underlayment you will place. This underlayment has a sticky adhesive side and a plastic side as mentioned before. Make sure that you peel back the adhesive and stick it onto the plastic to connect all the underlayment together. Previously, I mentioned that some planks do come with underlayment, and while you technically don't need to double up on it, we personally always place underlayment because it helps further reduce any unevenness in the floor. It also adds more sound absorption and acts as another moisture barrier to the bottom of the plank. Now that all the prep work is covered, let's hop into the tools that you'll need or that are useful, and then we'll move on to how to use them for the actual install. Starting off with the tools used for the physical installation, these are a rubber or plastic flooring mallet, a tapping block, flooring pull bar, flathead screwdriver, baseboard remover, and a 1/4 inch spacer. Next are the tools that help with measurements, and those are pencils, markers, tape measures, speed square, angle finder tool, and a piece of your baseboard. Finally, these tools will help you with cutting planks. Those are a miter saw, circular saw, or a plank cutter, a jigsaw, a table saw, multi-tool, safety glasses, and ear protection. Since we've covered all the tools, now we can go over the installation step by step. There are 3 quick but important things that we have to cover about planks before we get to the installation. First, notice here that some patterns do repeat or look very similar, so when you are selecting your next piece to install, make sure you like how it looks next to the surrounding pieces. Make sure to also check for any damages on the planks or edges as well. Second, you'll need to stagger subsequent plank rows to make the floor secure and not prone to buckling or popping out. How you stagger them is also an aesthetic choice, so choose whatever pattern of staggering that you like. Third, there are 2 tongue sides on every plank located here and here. And opposite of those are the groove sides located here and here. Notice as I turn the board, the sides switch. Tongue and groove lock together by installing a tongue and a groove side together like this. Once they are flat and flush together, they are secured. Moving on to the actual installation, we'll start by placing our first plank. Once you have your plank, place it against the wall in the direction that you want the rows to follow, and place a spacer between the plank and the wall to allow for any expansion the flooring may have. After that, we move on to half installs, since you're only connecting one side. First, we will be lifting up the second plank and putting the tongue and groove together like this, using a firm but not hard force. Evenly press the full width of the board into the previous plank and lower it as you see the pieces are flush together and create a minimal gap. Done correctly, you can see my piece is laying flush on the ground and is ready for me to use a tapping block to secure the planks together. To properly use the tapping block, note the cutouts on the underside. You'll end up using both cutouts depending on the position of your board and how you're tapping the block in. For this example, we'll be using the most shallow cutout since it's level with the plank when we place the block on the ground. This will greatly reduce the chance of damaging the end of the plank as you are hitting it in. Remember to hold the block against the plank with firm pressure and only use light or moderate strength when hitting to minimize the chance of damage. Continue repeating this process until you reach the end where a full piece can no longer fit. One very important note is that if you have any pieces that have difficulty connecting, never force them together. Remove it and check for glue, broken tongue and groove, or debris that may have been preventing it from connecting together. Then try again. Congratulations on reaching the end of your first row. Now we'll go over how to measure the final piece for a perfect fit. As you can see here, a full-length board will not fit in this row, so I'll show you two different ways to measure this length. The most apparent method would be to use a tape measure as shown on screen now. Keep in mind that you want to measure at the end of the plank and not the tongue or the groove. Remember to leave a small gap at the end of your plank, roughly 1/4 of an inch. When transferring this measurement to your plank, first remember to set up your plank in the same orientation as the row. Then start your measurement from the beginning of the wood. After that, it's as simple as cutting your piece to your measured size and saving the other piece for future use. The second way you can measure the end piece only requires a marking device and adequate space. Here you can see that I first turn my board 180 degrees from the original row orientation. Then I line up the plank next to the opening. This can be done on top or adjacent to the opening. I then leave a gap on the end. Once those are all fulfilled, I then mark it right where it would connect to the previous plank, and there's my measurement for the plank. Some of you may be wondering why I rotate the plank, and that is because we need the ends to still line up into the tongue and groove orientation. If I would have left it at the original orientation, I would be left with the correct size for the opening, but it would be groove to groove or tongue to tongue. Now that you've measured and cut your piece, let's go over and check if it's a perfect fit. Quickly test fit your piece like this by partially installing the tongue and groove together. Once it's connected, grab a piece of baseboard that you'll be using and place it against the wall on top of the plank. If the baseboard covers the plank, you're all set. If it is short, then you'll need to decide if you want to cut another plank longer or if you'll be installing baseboard and quarter rounds throughout your project space to make up for the gap. With the perfect plank size, we can now talk about installation. You'll follow the same steps that we covered with one substitution, which is switching out the tapping block for a pull bar or sometimes a baseboard remover. Same concepts apply here to the pull bar. Place it on the end and make sure it has a firm hold onto the plank. I personally like using my foot to hold down the pull bar as I hit it. Now we'll move on to the majority of what your install will look like. Then we'll move on to difficult or weird cuts that you'll likely run into. Starting off with the first plank in a new row, you can either use the end piece that you just cut to start off this row to give it the staggered pattern, or you can cut a piece to fit the aesthetic that you like for your staggered pattern. You'll install this plank just like before. Generally speaking, you will always move in the same direction for installation, since the leftover end planks that were cut can be used as new starting pieces. Here you can see that we're now installing planks into two existing areas along the length of the board and the end of the board. Depending on the situation or your preference of installation, you can either install the length first, then use a tapping block to lock in the width, or you can do the inverse, which would be installing the width first, then the length. But we'll cover both installation examples for clarity. In either situation, you'll want to follow the same steps. For this example, we'll start with the length. First, you'll want to place the plank's tongue and groove together, creating a semi-flush fit like this, even though the plank you're installing is lifted off the ground. You can also see here that I've left a little space on the installation width end, since the tongue and groove need a little bit of space to fit into each other. After that, you'll use your tapping block to secure them together, which will slowly bring down and level out the install plank. Remember to hold the block against the plank with firm pressure and use light taps. It is very easy to damage the plank here since you have no other backing to help prevent the block from shifting and chipping the plank. Once it is just about level, you'll go down the full length of board and tap to fully secure it. Now that the full length is installed, we will now move our tapping block on the width end that is not being installed and start tapping it over. You may notice that where it connects together may not be perfectly level, and this is normal. Sometimes you can get lucky and the continued tapping will easily straighten it out for a faster installation. Other times you may need help from someone or a semi-heavy object, about 5 pounds, to place on the plank to make the groove install easier. For this next example, we'll cover the inverse, which is installing the width first, then the length. Remember to leave a gap along the length for the tongue and groove to fit together. Here you can see I am fitting the width first. One advantage with installing the width first is since it is shorter than the length, you can usually fully install the tongue and groove together by using light force and leverage or minimal use of the tapping block. Now that your width end is fully flush and connected, you'll want to start at the connected end and use the tapping block to start connecting the length. Be sure not to hit too hard as you move down the length since it can force the width end to disconnect from each other. Congratulations, you've now learned how to install and connect the first and subsequent rows of your flooring, which is the majority of the work. Now we'll quickly cover over the common weird or difficult cuts that you'll likely run into and how you can measure and cut them to perfect size. Those type of cuts will be width cuts, angle cuts, notch cuts, L cuts, U cuts, and H cuts. Do be aware that as you're working on your own projects, you'll likely have to use a combination of these cuts together. When I say width cuts, what I'm talking about are areas where you'll need to reduce the width of a plank for it to perfectly fit in that area. But before you measure and cut your piece, always use your baseboard as a reference for if you need to fill this area. Here, you can see that the baseboard will cover the gap, while over here, the baseboard will not. Sometimes the space that you're trying to fill will be even all the way across, only requiring one measurement to be able to fill the gap perfectly. However, rarely in DIY is everything perfect, and you'll likely need two measurements. So let's cover how to find those two measurements. First, line up your plank exactly where it needs to be inserted, but on the previous row. Then take a measurement at the beginning of the wall to start the previous plank. Then transfer that to your plank. Then move towards the bottom and repeat the same process. Now you'll use any straight tool or object to connect these marks together to create one continuous line that you will cut to make the perfect piece. As a tip, you can usually use another piece of plank as the guide. If the difference between the two spots is less than a half an inch, you can usually get away with using the smaller measurement across the whole plank. That way you can save time by using a table saw to cut it at an equal size. But be aware that this only works if your baseboard thickness is enough to cover the narrow side. Once the piece is cut, you'll install it like the other pieces. If the width is large enough, it will easily fit and lock into place. However, if the width is narrow, it'll have a difficult time locking in and will angle upwards. If this is the case, you'll need to use multiple tools and techniques to press the tongue and groove together while simultaneously pressing them down to get them to lock into each other. Sometimes, even with all the tools and the perfect technique, it still won't lock in. You may need to use a nailer, glue, or baseboard to hold them down. It doesn't have to be all three of these, but you will need to find a way to hold the piece in place. Now moving on to angled cuts. You will first need to use a tape measure and measure the distance starting from either the tongue or the groove side all the way until it makes contact with the angle. Then you'll want to use an angle finder tool or something similar that pivots in the middle while keeping two straight ends. For this example, I'm starting my measurement on the previous board on the groove side since it's easiest for me to see the measurement. I then transfer this measurement onto my plank. Then I take the angle finder tool and make one end flush against a previously installed plank and adjust the other end until it is flush against the wall, since this tool perfectly mimics the angle. I then align the tool flush with the installed plank and with my mark, then trace the angle. From there, I personally use a miter saw to line up the angle and cut it. Remember, it does not have to be perfect to the degree, just close enough where the baseboard will cover the gap. Notch cuts are used when something protrudes into the path of your plank but does not go all the way through the width or the length. For this example, we'll be covering this doorway here that has already been cut and installed. You can see the doorway goes through the majority of the plank's width, but also a few inches into the plank's length. There are 4 measurements that will be needed for this cut, and I'll show you how to get them. To obtain the perfect measurements for things like this, you want to first align your plank in the opening right next to where you're about to install it and make sure it's end to end like this. Then you can either eyeball or use any straight object to get these 2 measurements, where the notch needs to start and where it needs to stop. Which you'll mark at the end of the plank here. This gives you the length measurement. After that, you'll be using a tape measure starting from the previous plank to where the end of the notch needs to be, like this, giving you the width of the measurement. Now you'll transfer that measurement onto your plank while lined up on the previous mark. Use a speed square or other straight object to line up and mark the area that you need to cut. Typically, with cuts like these, you'll need to use any combination of tools like a drill with a drill bit, jigsaw, and a saw. L-shaped cuts are needed in areas like this, where entire sections of a plank's length will need to be removed. Measuring this is very similar to the notch cuts. We'll start again by lining it up next to the previous piece and alongside the area where it will need to be cut, then marking where the L cut needs to start, giving us the length measurement. Then we take this measurement from the previous plank row to the end of our object, giving us the starting width measurement. As mentioned in the width cut section, you'll need to take 2 measurements. Since we just marked the beginning, we'll need to move down and get the ending measurement. Once we have the ending marked, we now need to line up and mark the starting and ending lengths. And from there, you can cut the plank to size and install it like all the other pieces. Moving on to U-shaped cuts, you'll most often see these in doorways that run alongside your flooring. In most cases, you'll want to plan around these doors and use U-cuts instead of H-cuts since they're easier to install and much more forgiving. U-shaped cuts are very similar to notch and L-cuts, with the difference of cutting out the middle section of a plank while retaining both tongue and groove sides. The most important part to address here is that you need to plan ahead for the U and H-shaped cuts at least 1 row before you're about to cut. U-cuts are usually installed in pairs since you'll have to build planks out to the left and right of the doorway. For this example, we'll be looking at this doorway where I already installed 2 U-shaped cuts. To make this install the easiest, you'll want to start this row inside the doorway instead of at one of the ends like you typically would. This makes fitting and installing the planks significantly easier since it isn't connected to other pieces yet and gives you more maneuverability. You'll take your first plank and decide where it should be placed within the doorway in regards to your stagnation pattern. Generally, you'll want to put the planks in the middle of the doorway. That way, the long, narrow ends have equal space to bend up and down into the gap. If possible, the next thing you'll want to do is start with whichever plank has the groove side on the end of the width that is exposed in the doorway. In this example, it is the right plank. The reason for this is because the physical tongue lip is smaller than the groove lip, which makes fitting the pieces into the gap a little easier. With your first piece chosen, you'll need to repeat the same steps as the L cut. So line up your planks and get the measurements just like before. But now, when you need to get the opposite length measurements, you'll build out a small row with planks to use to get the other starting and ending marks for the plank length. What usually makes this install difficult is the tight margins on the cut, since it has to fit between 2 walls and it can't be too narrow or too wide. Cutting it too narrow will make it difficult to install but perfect for the baseboard, while cutting it too wide makes it easy to install, but now the baseboard won't cover the gap. So you'll need to find a happy medium between the two, with a preference to be a little bit wider just for faster installs. Once you've marked and cut your plank, you'll install it just like any other piece. Do note that sometimes you'll need to remove the previously installed row just to make the installation a little bit easier. Once you've done that, now you'll need to turn your attention to the other U-shaped cut and repeat the process all over again. Moving on to the last weird cut, we have the H cut. As mentioned before, this is basically 2 U-cuts put together and can be very difficult when it is a full-length piece. Generally, you'll follow the same steps as the U-cut, but with the H-cuts, we aren't starting in the doorway. We usually have to make the H-cut because we already started the row and it's currently going through a doorway. You will still need to follow all the same steps to get the measurements that we just went over to get the perfect piece, making sure you left the right amount of space for an easy install. The biggest issue you may run into with the H-cut install is trying to fit the plank in the doorway and the opening, since your walls or cuts may not be perfect. But other than that, once you have it in the opening, it's the exact same install process. Okay, now that we've covered all the technical parts about installing the tongue and groove flooring, now it's time to move on to some tips and tricks. 1. Hammer weight. We use a Brutus 12-ounce hammer that is a perfect balance of power and weight for installing flooring. 2. Tool placement. Having cutting tools nearby, keeping pull bars at the end, having tape measures and pencils, as well as hammers and tapping blocks in logical areas dramatically increases how efficient you are. 3. Power tool dust cleanup. Make sure you have a vacuum or a blower to remove all the dust after cutting planks. This dramatically reduces how much cleanup you have to do at the very end. Tip number 4. 3 people is very efficient. We've noticed that having one person to cut as well as inspect planks and the other 2 to install alternating rows and give measurements is a very effective methodology. 5. Make sure you're using discarded pieces for stability. When building into areas that allow you to build upwards and downwards simultaneously, make sure you use discarded pieces by installing them and drilling them down. That way you can have added stability as you move in one direction. And there you have it, our extensive guide on all the important stuff you need to know to start your own tongue and groove plank flooring project. Until next time, take it easy.